China's biggest political event of the year is well underway in Beijing. What are some of the country's foreign policy priorities for 2025? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. On Friday, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi held his annual press conference on the sidelines of the third session of the 14th National People's Congress. He answered questions on China's foreign policy and international diplomacy. We begin with this report from CGTN's Huang Fei in Beijing.
Well, we heard extensive comments on topics ranging from China-U.S. relations, regional security, the global south, and so on. But Mr. Wang starts with laying out China's role on the diplomatic front. He says that China will stand on the right side of history and promote human progress, seeking strength through unity. He also highlighted some achievements in China's head of state diplomacy. Here's more on what he said.
The year 2025 is important for both China and the world. There will be new highlights in China's head of state diplomacy. Last month, President Xi attended the opening ceremony of the Asian Winter Games, marking the beginning of the diplomatic events that China will host this year. We will solemnly commemorate the 80th anniversary of the victory in the Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression and the World Anti-Fascist War, and hold a series of major events, including the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. President Xi is expected to make a number of overseas visits. Head of state diplomacy will write a new chapter of closer cooperation and shared success between China and the world.
Yes, there were many questions about the U.S., especially a mention of Washington's pretext for the trade war, which is that China is playing a role on the fentanyl crisis. On that, Mr. Wang responded by saying that China actually has some of the toughest anti-narcotics measures in the world, and it's helping the U.S. curb the illegal drug on humanitarian grounds, and the U.S. cannot return good with evil. And he says that China-U.S. relations should be based on reciprocal cooperation. And he's happy to see that more countries are resonating with this idea, that the fact that three-quarters of the countries in the world have joined the Belt and Road Initiative, really supporting China's idea of building a community with a shared future for mankind. This year, China is also rotating president of the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Mr. Wang announced that the SCO summit will be held in Tianjin in the autumn, with around 100 events across different sectors to promote exchanges under this framework. Now, China is, of course, also a member of the Global South. Mr. Wang fielded questions from Africa and Latin American nations, and he says that the hallmark of our era is the prominent and growing strength of the Global South, and because this area contributes to 80% of global growth, and he says that development remains the central agenda going forward. Of course, he also touched on China-EU relations, with the two sides celebrating 50 years of diplomatic ties this year. So wide-ranging questions, detailed answers, really giving us a clear picture of where China stands on the global stage.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Sourabh Gupta is a senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. From Johannesburg, David Monyae is an Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations and the Director of the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. And from Beijing, we're joined by Huiyao. He is the former Counselor of the China State Council and the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Huiyao, let me start with you. This was a very wide-ranging news conference by the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. He addressed a number of issues, and he addressed a number of regions around the world as well. What were your main takeaways?
Well, I think this year, Foreign Minister Wang Yi's news conference was very timely and also at this critical moment. And he actually, during the conference, emphasized China's role in become a just force, making peace, but also trying to safeguard the global multilateral system, and particularly emphasized the UN as its core system. So I think he's also covered a wide range of topics, spent an hour and a half, and also talked with answer the question from correspondent from US, also and Europe and Asia countries and many other countries too. So I think this is a wide ranging, and the key message you can take away is that China still maintain a consistent position and wants to be open and wants to really be a adjustable force, and also keep opening again for all the world, and then to really assure the world that China will be the same. We continue to safeguard multilateralism, and also will also emphasize that China is not afraid any other tariff or whatever. We should restrain from becoming double standards or double face, and then really trying to maintain a good relation. And China did improve relations with countries like India and Japan, many countries in ASEAN, and of course also maintain good relations with European countries now. So I think this conference is very timely and answers the many good questions.
Right, and Wang Huiyao, looking at some of these specifics, Minister Wang Yi said that if the United States continues to, quote, using his words here, try to contain China, then we will resolutely counteract. How did you interpret that?
Well, I think that's probably, it's really the key message that China wants to really send is that China, of course, doesn't really want to get involved in entire trade war. But if we imposed on China, China is not afraid of that. As a matter of fact, you see what happened in the first term of Trump. That there's about, actually tariff war there 5-6 years ago, and until now, actually, the trade between China and U.S. not decreased, but actually gone up over 20%. And actually, China is much better prepared at this time. So the high fence, small yard is not really helping U.S., but really helping China, making China realize that many things happen: the green power transition, artificial intelligence, and digital economy. You name it. They are actually become even more stronger now. So. What message you sending them to, this kind of isolation policy, this kind of tactics and trade tariffs on China is not going to help China, but also going to hurt U.S. It's basically the U.S. consumer going to take the cost. So I think that China is basically emphasize the principle. Of course, Minister Wang is still emphasize they want to have a mutual respect and peaceful coexistence and win-win cooperation with U.S., not anything else.
Sourabh Gupta, I want to continue talking about the Chinese response to the tariffs that have been imposed by the United States. Of course, China has taken retaliatory measures as well. Minister Wang Yi, he said that one should not fantasize that the United States can suppress China and maintain good relations at the same time. What did you make of those comments?
I think he's talking an absolute truth out there, in terms of that China has learned the modus operandi of the Trump administration, having seen Trump during his first term, and that he is not an unknown quantity. During the first term, there was a lot of sweet talk at times from Mr. Trump, but there were a lot of punitive actions from the administration against China. And I think the motto going forward for the Chinese is that the measure of the man, that is Donald Trump, will be not in his words, but what his administration actually does in terms of its actions. And swallowing sweet talk and punitive actions swallowing sweet talk from Mr. Trump, but punitive actions from his administration is going to be a non-starter from China. I think China, as we've already seen from its responses to the 2 tranches of tariffs, or rather the 10% tariff, which was then raised to 20% with regard to the fentanyl issue, China's response has been immediate, it has been wide-ranging, but it also has been measured. And that's what I think the Chinese side wants to get across. There will be assured retaliation. China is not seeking to enter into a trade war. It hopes to have both peaceful coexistence and beneficial win-win mutual trade with the United States, but it won't be turning its cheek and getting slapped and hoping that Mr. Trump can then talk with Mr. Xi and that China's actions would somehow be stayed against China, against the United States. That modus operandi is not going to function, and that China is ready to give as good as it gets.
And Sourabh, the minister also referred to current tensions in many parts of the world, and he said that China would act as a stabilizing force, a force for world peace and security and stability. He criticized the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, saying that it has provoked incidents and has created divisions. What was your assessment of that?
This is part of the overall message that the Chinese side wants to put out, that it is in these disrupted times wants to be an anchor of stability. It wants to be a responsible stakeholder and play and abide by the existing rules, and hope that all the major players would also abide by those rules, so that the multilateral system can be protected. It's the primary message, particularly vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific. I think China has been very upset with regard to the US taking actions such as placing its mid-range offensive systems in the Philippines. As China has noted previously, this is the first time since the end of the Cold War that a strategic offensive system has been deployed in Asia. This does not help in managing and bringing about peaceful coexistence. It leads to arms racing and leads to tensions. And I think it's these sort of actions that the US has taken that the Chinese side is unhappy about. You know, down the line, these things can cascade into major conflicts, as we see in Eurasia and in Ukraine, especially with NATO incrementally creeping forward and towards Russia's boundaries. And I think the message to the US is that they need to show a degree of restraint. They need to play by global rules, and if they do so, the world can be off in a better place. And China, at least, will not be provoking tensions, but China will not be sitting back and is going to show its deterrent capabilities too. But on the whole, it's the message is of wanting to have cooperation, wanting to have coexistence. But regardless of where the US is, China is going to be that anchor of stability in the international system.
David Monyae, good to see you again. Minister Wang also said that the countries of the Global South were a key force in maintaining world peace and driving world development and improving global governance. He noted that the Global South is now responsible for something like 40% of global GDP. He referred to the continent of Africa specifically, and he said countries should support the continent in a new development path of self-reliance and self-strengthening. What did you make of it? Is this just more evidence, just more confirmation that we live in a changing world, a multipolar world, in which we are seeing the countries of the Global South making their voices heard?
Oh, indeed. I think Minister Wang's the press conference really should be understood within a much more broader context, one in which President Trump's second administration had just kick-started in a rough way in Washington, unraveling the world order of post-1945, in which China itself sees itself as a true member of the Global South. The speech also went on to give assurance that for the Global South to succeed in this rough world, firstly, there's a need for unity as well as cooperation, strengthening of multilateral realism, as well as dealing with the core issues of development in which China commits itself to continue. When it comes directly to Africa, our own continent, he went on to elaborate even more that it is a rich continent with it's a future market. And China wants to continue working with it, and there can never be global development without Africa's modernization. I think those were key issues that came out throughout the press conference.
Wang Huiyao, Minister Wang was also asked about China's relations with Russia. You know, that's been a big focus over the last 3 years. He said that the deep friendship and ties between the two countries would not change no matter how the worlds change. You know, we are fully aware that China is facing very harsh sanctions from the Western world right now. But what did you make of those comments?
China has a very strong and solid relations with Russia because historically there are some problems, as we all know. But recent few decades, China has managed to get along and with Russia now because we have the longest border in the world. We have 4,000 kilometers borders along the Russia and China, and then because of trade, I think that also has increased the Russian economy. They kept about almost 5%, 4% or 5% growth GDP last year, and thanks largely, I think, also on China's trade. China trade with Russia has doubled or tripled in the last 10, 15 years. So I think now that there was saying that U.S. now is normalized with Russia, is we have another Nixon moment for China, which I don't think is going to happen. There's a deep distrust between Russia and the West for the last 7 decades, and is not resolving that. And then the Ukraine war and all this conflict probably would add another 10, 20 years mistrust again between Russia and the West countries. So I think China, being a very strong neutral actually player in this Ukraine-Russian war, has been really very standby to promote peace and stability. So I think now, if they want to solve this Ukraine-Russian crisis, China become a balancing power now, because if you talk about UN peacekeeping force of the permanent member countries, China is the largest sending country of UN peacekeeping force. Yeah. I don't think Russia is going to accept there's a NATO troops come back again. And so some kind of BRICS troops going back to the conflict region could be a good stabilizing and promoting peace factor.
So what are your thoughts on what the minister said about resolving the Ukraine conflict? He said China's view was, in his words, objective and impartial, and that China was ready to play a role in resolving the crisis. Importantly, he said, the security of one country cannot be built on the insecurity of another.
I think that's an important point. That's a point that's been raised by the Russians, of course, but it's a point that has been raised on multiple times by China also, and that security is indivisible. And in this respect, one cannot just be expecting that one can be self-indulgent in trying to have one's own security, which is framed in contradistinction to the security of other countries. As I talked about, that is part of why China has taken such a strong position with regard to the deployment of that strategic offensive system in the Philippines. In it by itself, its deployment does not is an unhappy development, but it doesn't tip the balance in any particular way. But it's these sort of actions which, when accumulated together, which really bring major powers on the brink of major power conflict. And that's why this is where the issue of security and at the expense of insecurity of others comes in. With regard to Ukraine, I think China has played a responsible role in trying to be as best a facilitator that it can, in terms, given its equities involved in the conflict. There are limits to what China can do with regard to the Ukraine theater from a geopolitical perspective, from a peacemaking perspective, and China is operating within those limits. And its main principle going forward is that let's not worsen this conflict. Let's try to have a ceasefire. Let's stabilize the conflict, and then let's incrementally try to start resolving the issues in the conflict.
Okay, and that's where we will leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We now turn our discussion to South America. Earlier, I spoke with the former Peruvian Minister of Economy and Finance, Luis Miguel Castilla, and I asked him how he would characterize China-Peru bilateral relations.
Peru and China have a very robust relationship. Peru also is home to one of the largest Chinese diasporas in Latin America. And China is our main trading partner. We send about a third of our exports to China. and it's becoming an important source of foreign direct investment. So I think it's a very robust relationship that goes beyond trade and investment, and goes towards our cultural links and historical relationship and friendship over the years.
Right, I want to just talk about some of the specifics on the trade and economic relationship. Peru signed a free trade agreement with China. That was in 2009. And the bilateral free trade agreement was upgraded last year. China, as you point out, is Peru's largest trading partner, export market and source of imported goods. In 2023, bilateral trade amounted to $37.6 billion. So looking at all of that, how significant is the partnership?
Very significant, because Peru has pursued a policy of free trade agreements and open policies. We have shied away from protectionist measures for the past 30 years. And the fact that we've been able to optimize and upgrade our free trade agreement with China recently opens new markets, in particular for non-traditional products. I think this is a process of working close together, our authorities, and this is key for sectors that are intensive, that are very labor intensive. We are looking towards new markets for our agro-industrial products, for instance, and go beyond the usual mining exports that we send to China. China is the recipient of most of our copper exports overseas. But I think it's good policy to diversify not only your markets, but also the products that you send to markets that are so important as the Chinese one. And part of this strategy of being close, Peru being close to Asia and to China in particular, is also upgrading our investments. An important port was inaugurated in Peru a few months ago, the port of Chancay, which has gathered global attention. And I think the potential for logistic costs reduction and for more trade between Peru and its neighbors with China and the rest of Asia is critical for growth story going forward.
You mentioned Shanghai. That was a very important development in the trade relationship. How has it reshaped Peru's trade, not just with China, but with the rest of the world? And, you know, we're talking about trade from the hinterland of Latin America as well.
Yes, I think an important issue to highlight is that the opening up of our ports and our free trade agreements has accelerated investments in our infrastructure. We need to tackle bottlenecks in how connected we are within Peru and also with our neighbors. There is a huge potential, for instance, to pursue more intra-trade deals with our neighbors, with Colombia and Ecuador to the north, and with Chile, and obviously the big market of Brazil. But we have important geographical barriers. So if this openness and this new infrastructure triggers more investment in railways and in highways to connect our markets to our production sites, to our export markets, I think that would be good for a country that depends on exports and investment to continue growing at faster rates. And this is critical in these trying times where protectionist winds are blowing from some industrialized countries.
And in terms of the revenues that this port will bring in, as well as the number of jobs it would create, how will that impact Peru?
This is a process that it is a port that will increase our GDP by more than 1%. But this goes in a sequence. In the short term, where the port is trying to open new lines and to be able to use multimodal sources of communication from our neighboring countries and also from within Peru. So the potential is huge, and this could definitely add over close to 2 percentage points of GDP to the Peruvian economy in the future. And just to give you an idea, tax receipts could also increase and creating employment as we try to diversify our economies. Beyond trade, there's a sense of industrializing our country and having free trade areas where we actually add value to our natural resources and to attract investment from within Latin America to export to Asian markets is an important opportunity to actually boost our growth performance. And from growing on average 3%, we could actually grow to 5% in the next few years based on this important strategic ties with Asian markets and with China in particular.
Right, in terms of the exports that will flow through the port of Shanghai, you mentioned earlier on that Peru is a major exporter of minerals. These are primary goods that go to China. But in the coming years, do you see that changing? Do you see Peru's manufacturing capability change?
Well, one of the main areas that one of our main non-traditional exports is apparel and garment, textile products. And what we try to do is we're trying to add value to our natural resources. So beyond sort of the copper and the energy transition, demand that the world will have for critical metals such as copper, we're trying to add value. That's one of the key challenges that we have looking forward, to be less dependent on changes in commodity prices. Every time there is a bust in copper prices, that has an important economic impact in our country. So part of diversifying our economy, of adding value, becoming more competitive, and but being able to add value to our natural resources is part of our growth strategy, as I mentioned. So there's also services. Services is important in our economy, and I think all the APEC progress that is being pursued in other areas and incorporating technology, AI, and other ways to actually add value to our export production is something that will definitely benefit Peruvian economy that is looking for different engines of growth beyond mining and the traditional exports that we've become used to depend over the past few years.
And Peru is China's second largest investment destination in Latin America, with about 200 Chinese companies investing about $30 billion so far in the country. How have these investments by Chinese companies, impacted the Peruvian economy?
Very much so, because we're a country that needs foreign savings to finance its investment needs. And we have actually seen Chinese investment evolve. Over 25 years ago, the first investment was in iron by a Chinese company, and now we have very sophisticated players in different sectors beyond mining. Mining obviously is quite relevant, but we have in energy, we have in infrastructure, in finance, in construction, an entry of Chinese firms that bring new technologies, and it's something that we think it's good for our economy to have a very much a diversified source of FDI into our country. So this has definitely benefited Peru, and as Chinese products become more sophisticated, this will definitely produce spillovers into our economy, and that will be good for our workers and for the progress of our society.
Minister Luis Miguel Castilla, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the time.
And that's where we will leave it. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.